If you had to pick one company to tell the story of China's rise over the past 4 decades, its growing clout overseas, and its recent clashes with the West, you would have to choose Huawei. Today, the technology giant is probably best known outside China for its equipment, which forms the backbone of many major telecom networks, and is a source of angst for Western politicians and intelligence services. It's also known for its smartphones, which are still widely sold around the world. But Huawei is much more than that. It's a force in cloud computing, in self-driving cars, and now also in semiconductors. The company's history is therefore a kind of microcosm of the development of the Chinese economy. It was founded in the mid-1980s by Ren Zhengfei, a former engineer in the People's Liberation Army in the special economic zone of Shenzhen, southern China. Over the next 3.5 decades, it evolved from making simple telephone switches to developing more sophisticated communications technology, probably by imitating Western rivals, and exported it aggressively into international markets. It then found itself squarely in the crosshairs of US-China tensions, first for evading US sanctions, and then over security concerns. This led to the detention and house arrest of Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei and the daughter of the founder. These days, it is something of a Chinese champion at the forefront of trying to help China keep up with developments in artificial intelligence as the US and its allies clamp down on technology exports. So that's why this week on The Big View, we are delving into Huawei's past, present, and future. It's what we do at Reuters Breaking Views. We tap our best sources around the world to bring you fresh insights into the biggest stories in global business and finance. I'm your host, Peter Thalassen. My guest this week is Eva Doe. Eva is a reporter for the Washington Post, covering technology policy. She's a native of Detroit, and she reported on business and politics in Asia for a decade before moving back to the US. And she is the author of a new book, House of Huawei, A Secret History of China's Most Powerful Company. Eva Doe, welcome to The Big View.
Thanks for having me here.
So, there's a lot to talk about in this book, but I guess I wanted to start with sort of one of the big questions that's been hanging over Huawei for a long time and has been for its entire existence, I guess, and has been the subject of this huge debate nationally, internationally, which is the question of its ownership and specifically the identity of its shareholders and supposed ties to the government and the military. I'm wondering, in your research, how close did you get to the bottom of that story?
Well, this was one of the mysteries that I spent quite a bit of time researching because very little has been known about Huawei's original shareholders. Just that Ren Zhengfei, the founder, had 5 shareholders that came on board at the beginning and eventually came offline. And so sort of looking through local records in Shenzhen, what I found was some of them did have ties to the local government or local state-owned enterprises at the time, which for that time in the nascent days of China's market economy was very natural.
Yeah.
But you kind of see how this company was incubated out of this effort to start building private companies. And then more recently, Huawei is not a publicly traded company. It's owned by its employees, is sort of how the company puts it. And so that really means that from the outside, it's very unclear exactly who owns Huawei and what to what stakes. And so what we do understand is early, some of these executives who joined the company early have, significant influence in the company through through their shareholdings.
Yeah, so I guess the question I have about this is how important is that question of the shareholding really? I mean, there is this seemingly endless debate in China about state-owned companies on the one hand and private companies on the other, and which side is on the up or on the way down. But Huawei seems to me to show that this discussion is much more nuanced. It's ostensibly a private company, but its success is intimately entwined with government support, with contracts from government-owned companies, state promotion overseas. Does the question of its ownership, how much does that really matter, do you think, in the whole story of Huawei?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it does matter to a degree, and that if it's a publicly owned company, there's much more leverage that international shareholders, for instance, might have
Yeah.
in the company's operations. I think at this point, probably the most important factor is just Huawei's role in China's national strategy and aspirations for high tech. It plays sort of an irreplaceable role right now in many critical fields. And I think that tie, more than any sort of explicit shareholding one or that kind of monetary tie, I think probably sort of explains the interaction it has with the state.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I definitely think that's the changing role of Huawei and the sort of the fact that it's become this sort of national champion is something we should get back to. But I just want to ask you a bit about the sort of the origins of the book. I mean, it's full of interesting little details about the company, particularly in its early days. It seems like you've done a lot of digging there. Obviously, we know Huawei as being historically a pretty secretive company, really. And although you covered it closely, you say Huawei didn't comment for the book. I'm just wondering, like, as a reporter, how hard was it for you to unearth some of this information that you dug up for the book?
Yeah. So sort of when I started to feel that a project like this was possible was when I came across the book that Huawei's founder Ren Zhengfei had written when he was the military engineer for China's military. That was back in 1979, and it was this yellowed little booklet, pretty slim, but it was the kind of relic that I didn't realize was sort of there in a public library. And
Mm.
it made me realize that, this company, it's played such an important role in China's tech industry, not only for years, but for decades. And so it doesn't move through the world without sort of leaving a wake. And so when I started to look, in local government records, in retired government officials' memoirs, in court records around the world, I was kind of surprised at just what I was able to find. And I did talk to as many current and former Huawei employees as I could, and also other executives across the industry to try to build this picture of the company. And there were also two other resources that were really helpful. One was the court records from the trial of Meng Wanzhou, Huawei CFO in Vancouver, and I think that provided quite a few details of Huawei's story that had not come out in public before. And another part of it was actually just Huawei's internal record keeping. Like, this company has this really unique culture that the founder has instituted to try to make inspired staff to be more cultured, not just engineers, not just gearheads, but to think about philosophy, to think about history, to write. And so in sort of both their publicly published and internal publications, there's been thousands and thousands of pages that Huawei employees have written over the years that sort of document their work and um, how they think about their role in the world, which I found incredibly fascinating and also just really helped inform this book.
Yeah, and it seems like in those internal sort of newsletters almost that people were being quite honest about the issues facing the company, the challenges, people being working too hard, or the difficulties that they would face when going to foreign countries, trying to set up subsidiaries or to sell contracts. I mean, it was quite revealing. That is that, and that's not really been exposed to the outside world before, I guess.
Yeah, so that kind of frank honesty to some of their mistakes and some of the problems that they've had at the company, I think you would find it pretty rare in Western companies in the modern day.
Mm.
And there's sort of a direct line to the traditional communist culture of self-criticism, in that one of the purposes of them writing these essays and internal speeches was a self-criticism function, under sort of like the direction of Communist Party officials at the company, which, across China, this has been a relic after the Cultural Revolution, that you're supposed to remain humble, you're supposed to criticize yourself. Um, and so there's sometimes astonishing admissions that executives are making about mistakes that they've made in their work.
Yeah. The other thing that astonished me, and maybe this says more about sort of the current state of affairs, um, but there are some revealing sort of vignettes that remind us that relations between China and the West were not always so tense. So you have this, you talk about Huawei hiring teams of consultants from IBM to help them sort of reorganize the company and to sort of learn from these other Western companies. And then there are talks about a possible sale to Motorola at some point, which may or may not have gone somewhere. And then later there's some discussions about Huawei buying parts of Nortel, which was the Canadian telecom equipment company. I mean, all of this seems unimaginable now, um, but at the time, it just shows you how close the sort of the relationships were between Western companies and Chinese companies, I suppose.
Yeah, I agree. I think um the current state of affairs, where companies like Huawei are seen as an urgent security threat to the United States, one that must be countered with very harsh policies. This is very new in the history of US-China relations, and probably the main reason is simply China was not nearly close enough of a competitor until very recently. The market was huge. It was seen as an enormous business opportunity for Western companies, and even if they and executives felt that even if they were giving up some of their second tier technologies, these Chinese companies were never going to catch up. And sort of the moment it was sort of when the 5G era arrived, which also coincided with the beginning of the Trump administration, that there was this big reassessment because people suddenly realized, Huawei, they're not behind. They're even by R&D standards, by the number of patents they have for 5G, they're actually ahead. And this is something that wasn't supposed to happen under a communist regime. This is something that they didn't think was possible, and that led to a lot of reassessments of how we should be, what our policies should be.
Yeah, and so there in that sort of discussion, I think from the Western side, the question is often posed, were Western governments and companies, were they naive? Were they complacent? Sort of, how did they, kind of how did they allow this to happen? But But do you sort of looking at it from the Huawei perspective, it gets presented often as, well, they set out to stealthily, kind of gather what technology they could and kind of embed themselves in different countries. Did do you think from the Huawei perspective there was a sense that this was going to become adversarial at some point? Or were they as surprised by that as everybody else was?
I think the founder, Ren Zhengfei, he has warned for decades to his staff that there might be these kind of um, this big battle with the United States one day, which a lot of people dismissed at the time, and probably part of his success when so many other Chinese companies have failed is he's been very cautious. He's been very sort of eyes wide open to what were the potential risks for his business. And so one thing that is pretty unique is just how low a profile he's kept among some of these tech CEOs, and that a lot of them in China, they're they reached sort of rock star status, sort of similar to Mark Zuckerberg in the United States, and they're very much out there. And he has not done that. And at one point, he said, "I'd keep a low profile, not to." Sort of make myself seem more mysterious and great, but because I'm actually scared. And yeah, so I think he has sort of taken this low-key approach to try not to alarm the West for years over just how good their technology was getting, and it worked for a long time.
It worked for a long time until it didn't, right? I mean, and then there was then they sort of ended up very much in the crosshairs of various Western governments. I mean, let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, it seems to me like just knowing a bit about the company and reading your book, there are kind of three different rough categories, right? There's sanctions is arguably the beginning, and then there's sort of concerns about surveillance, right? The fact that sort of Huawei equipment may be being used to listen in on other people, and then we end up in this period of sort of superpower rivalry. But just coming back to the sanctions to begin with, I mean, this was particularly the case was sort of the Huawei's supposed breach of U.S. export controls to Iran, which ultimately led to the arrest you mentioned earlier of Meng Wanzhou, Huawei's CFO, and the founder's daughter. And this kind of big high profile case in Canada about her extradition. I mean, it feels like they probably were a bit naive about all of that, weren't they? In terms of that the US would at some point kind of crack down on what they were doing there.
Yeah, I think none of them expected that the founder's daughter would be detained while for a case like this, and that the sanctions case against Huawei had until that point closely mirrored the one against ZTE, which was sort of their main Chinese rival in this sector. And the ZTE one was resolved with large fines, and with ZTE agreeing to a number of measures, but it did not reach the level of a senior executive being detained and sort of threatened with long-term prison time. And so I think that came as a complete surprise to them, that the US was raising the stakes that way.
So that was a big escalation. And we should say, obviously, China retaliated by arresting a couple of Canadian citizens and detaining them. Which led to this whole sort of high stakes kind of negotiation. I mean, do you think that was a conscious decision on the US part to really escalate the sort of the battle with Huawei and I guess by implication with China?
Well, I think the first Trump administration did see Huawei as a larger security and technological threat than ZTE. Mm-hmm. For one thing, its technology was more advanced, its market share around the world was higher. So there was a divergence in how they pursued these two cases.
Because at the same time, obviously, there was a big effort starting in the US, but then encouraged by the US in other countries to basically remove Huawei from telecom networks, right? Because of supposed fears about that there was some backdoor and the Chinese government could listen in on sensitive communications, or that they might have some kill switch where they could switch off entire telecom networks. I mean, looking back on that whole sort of debate now, how do you think about it? Was it really was that the real issue, or was it mainly a concern about about Huawei just becoming technologically too advanced and too indispensable?
Well, I think the security of telecommunications networks is a legitimate concern for countries. If you think about it, these are the pipes that carry all the information of a nation, the phone calls, internet traffic. And from that perspective, they're incredibly valuable. And also, you can see why they would be a target for espionage operations. And what has happened in globalization is it's almost impossible to build one of these networks that doesn't involve components from all around the world. And that was sort of the high point of globalization, where these just the business calculations were overriding over some of these security interests. And you've seen a large retreat, a pretty major reversal of that back towards sort of nationalized technologies around the world. And so there was this rip and replace program that began in the United States. They pushed the UK very hard to also do it. And sort of the reality is it's been very, very difficult, even in the United States, still in local networks across the country. There still is Huawei equipment because there was not enough funding for this program to just remove all of it. It's such an incredibly expensive process that actually in the latest defense budget, it was the stopgap funding for that was just approved. So, and this program was stalled for years. And now in the coming year, we might finally see that program moving to completion, that Huawei equipment's taken sort of fully out of US networks. And that just how long this process has been, even when there's sort of widespread bipartisan support for it in the United States, just shows, how difficult it is to try to reverse globalization.
Yeah, and I mean, Huawei also went to extraordinary lengths. I think you write about what they did in the UK to try and reassure the UK authorities about the security of the network, and they basically built this sort of separate entity and kind of staffed entirely by sort of British people or people who'd been approved by the British intelligence services who kind of had oversight of the network. And yet even that wasn't enough to reassure the British in the end. And they ended up sort of removing Huawei, or at least saying they were going to remove Huawei from the network. So I guess there was nothing Huawei could do ultimately to stop that.
Well, I think there's been a mindset shift, sort of a return to a Cold War-esque mindset, both by Western governments and in China's government. And that means elevated levels of distrust. And once you have that, you're trying to prove a negative, really, that no one who works at the company will ever hack the network, or no one will ever do anything to undermine the security. And it's impossible to prove at the end of the day.
So to what extent should we think about Huawei now and going forward as a sort of as a purely Chinese company, as opposed to a sort of a multinational, maybe even a sort of a global company? I mean, I was looking at their annual report, the most recent one we have, which is for 2023, but they were still making something like 20% of their revenue was coming from the sort of Europe, Middle East, Africa region. How do you sort of see them in terms of where the markets in which they can operate, and how in the areas in which they can operate outside China and the areas where they cannot?
I think more and more we're going to you'll be able to look at them as sort of a proxy for China's sphere of influence, in that the United States, sort of starting in the first Trump administration, continuing through Biden's administration, and likely continuing with the second Trump presidency, is going to be pushing very hard for governments around the world to not use Huawei equipment. And so, sort of which countries fall in line and which ones don't really has a lot to do with their relationships with Washington and Beijing. So Huawei will certainly continue to have a very strong presence across much of Asia and much of the Middle East and Africa. A number of European countries have already sort of committed to removing at least some of Huawei equipment, and we'll probably see that as an increasing trend. I think Huawei executives throughout their history, they did not want to just be a Chinese company. They wanted to be really a multicultural company. They want to be integrated with the world. And they had really mixed feelings with being so closely aligned and tied with the Chinese state. And they tried to escape that at times, you could see. But I think the current political environment makes that harder than ever for them. And so one of their recent announcements has been this coming year, they're going to be sort of fully making the switch to smartphones that don't run on Android, which has been a project that has been, they've been working on the R&D side of it for years. And that is kind of a symbol of, how they are being forced to sort of create their own system and like a Chinese ecosystem that's separate from the Western one.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it also seems like the sort of the hopes or the pressures or whatever that are being placed on them to sort of be at the vanguard of this Chinese technological development is quite striking, right? I mean, because we think of them as a maker of communications equipment and smartphones and things like that, but they've been making semiconductors. And you write about this episode in 2023 where they released a smartphone that included a 7 nanometer, or a chip with processors that were sort of 7 nanometers of the size, which surprised everybody because people didn't think the Chinese had the ability to produce those chips. So it almost feels like the company's sort of the things that they're being asked to do are becoming broader and sort of more complicated. Is that a fair sort of description?
Yes, and I think that's why they'll continue to be in the policy spotlight for U.S.-China relations, which is as U.S. sanctions have increased on blocking, shipment of advanced technology to China. Some of their technologies are now really important to China. They are the most advanced designer of AI chips right now in China, which for years and years, since the 90s, they've been working on making chips, but the vast majority they purchased from Western companies, the ones they actually used in their products. And their chip making operations were widely seen just as sort of this, like a sort of funny hobby that they had in the background. And since the first Trump administration, when there were sanctions blocking U.S. chip makers from selling products to them, their own chip making operations has become enormously important to not only the company's survival, but also other Chinese companies that are also under these kind of trade restrictions.
The sort of the comments you hear from the U.S. is that China, at least when it comes to AI chips, China's still several generations behind the sort of the leaders in the US. I mean, how do you sort of think about that going forward? Is that something that is that a gap you think that Huawei and other Chinese companies will be able to close with the likes of Nvidia, or are they sort of, is there a sort of a lasting disadvantage there? It's a big question, obviously.
One question is if they can catch up, and another question is even if they can't catch up, are they still a concern to the US? And that seems to be sort of the current stance, which is there is not really strong proof that China's really going to catch up to the cutting edge of these advanced technologies with the United States anytime soon. But they still uh, are can be seen as are seen as a serious security threat because of their current level, which the Biden administration has taken the stance that the United States now has to have as large of a lead as possible, as large of a technological lead as possible over China, which before we were content with just a relative lead.
Yeah.
So before the question was, can they catch up? And if we have a relative lead and they haven't caught up, then we're satisfied. But now, the idea now is that an adversary could still do a lot of damage with AI technologies as far as using it for hacking, using it for, developing military technologies, even if it's not quite as advanced as the most advanced technologies in the world.
Yeah. Let's talk briefly about numbers. I mean, we're Breaking Views. We like to sort of dig into the finances, and obviously Huawei is not a public company, so we don't have as much disclosure, but they do disclose some numbers. I mean, their revenue, and this is a big company, right? I mean, the revenue was $100 billion in 2023. Operating profit is about 15% of that figure. They invest a quarter of their revenue in R&D every year. I guess given sort of all the demands that are being placed on Huawei now, in terms of you talked about with chips and various other things, do they have the financial resource? Can they generate the financial resources internally to do what they need to do? Do you think? Can they be sort of self-sufficient financially and kind of meet all these demands?
I think in the current state of US-China relations, where Chinese policymakers feel that their tech industry is under existential threat from the United States, I think Huawei has become sort of too big to fail in China, and that they are seen as too crucial, a national champion, an irreplaceable company that for any critical projects that they're working on, probably there's not going to be the obstacle is not going to be financial resources that either through so they've benefited enormously from bank loans from China's policy banks over the years to support the expansion of their business. So they do have those lines of finance for projects that are seen as beneficial to the nation. And also they have a lot of R&D partnerships with other Chinese companies and also China's leading academic institutions. And so that's one way that they receive help from the state as well.
I see. Yeah. So back to that question of, are they a state-owned company or a private company? It's sort of somewhere in between, but they're quite heavily supported by the government, and maybe to an even greater extent than they were in the past.
Yeah. I think part of their success through the years has been that they have really marched in step with changes in Chinese policy. When China was starting to internationalize as it prepared to enter the World Trade Organization, they were one of the early companies going overseas and setting up offices around the world. More recently, with Xi Jinping's Belt and Road project, they've played a major role in helping China build infrastructure around the world. In recently, they've been working in all the hottest fields: artificial intelligence, sort of autonomous vehicles, robotics. So they are, very much seen as intertwined with policy missions on a national level.
Yeah. So maybe just to sort of wrap things up, I mean, thinking about the leadership of the company. I mean, so the founder, Ren Zhengfei, is I think 80 years old now. He's still the CEO. There's been talk over the years about succession, but it seem to be a terribly clear plan. They've had sort of rotating people around in various chairman positions and stuff. I mean, at some point, presumably, there's going to have to be a sort of a decisive change of leadership. And what do you think that looks like?
Yeah. Well, one recent change that has happened is that Ren Zhengfei's daughter, Meng Wanzhou, has joined the ranks of the 3 rotating chair people. So each of them, a third of the time, take on the role of steering the entire company. And that was something that for years and years, people thought was impossible. They thought Ren's children just did not have the engineering chops to lead a company like Huawei, and that they couldn't.
Well, he said that himself, I think, didn't he?
Yes, yeah, he said that himself for many years, and he indeed said his children would never become his successors. And that sort of what changed was Meng Wanzhou's detention in Canada, and she was seen as sort of a national hero in a way for being detained, even though it's very arguable if that's a heroic thing or not. But she returned with sort of.
She was under house arrest in Vancouver, right? I mean, it wasn't.
Yes.
She wasn't in a prison cell somewhere.
Exactly, she was under a pretty cushy house arrest, which also raised a lot of controversy compared to the stark prison conditions that the 2 Michaels, the Canadians, were facing in China. And so yeah, there is a lot of dispute about just how that her experience there should be viewed, but she somehow came back to China with a legitimacy to be promoted to one of the top leadership positions. So in a way, there is family succession at Huawei now. And yeah, I think in the coming years, at some point, the founder, Ren Zhengfei, is going to have to actually retire, and there'll be a question of who is the one person who's picked to replace them.
Fascinating. Well, Eva, this has been really interesting. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and tell us about the book House of Huawei. I'm sure there are more chapters to be written at some point in the future, but for now, thanks really very much for a fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much.
That's all we have time for this week. This podcast was produced by Oliver Taslich in London. You can listen to a new episode of The Big View every Tuesday on the Reuters app or your favourite podcast platform. Don't forget to tune in to our sister show, Viewsroom, every Thursday, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. If you liked what you heard, please follow The Big View and let us know what you think. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and Reuters.com.